It was a town gripped by fear. Fall River, Massachusetts. It was known for its working-class roots, and it became the unlikely epicenter of a terrifying string of murders that shook the community to its core. Beginning in the late 1970s, a series of brutal killings exposed a sinister underworld where manipulation, violence, and occult beliefs blended into a horrific reality. And at the heart of this nightmare was Carl Drew, a man who not only had two first names, but a man who proclaimed himself to be the son of Satan. And under his leadership, a small but dangerous cult emerged from the shadows of Fall River's red light district. They preyed on the vulnerable, and this cult enforced its reign of terror through brutal murder. Today, we are going to go through an exhaustive account of the events from the upbringing of the victims to the perpetrators of the cult formation. So guys, this one is a long one, and there's a lot of disturbing information, so please take care of yourself. It is absolutely horrific. Today, we are going to unpack the horrors of this group. So sit back, relax, and take a deep breath. It's time to let the fresh air in. Hi everyone, welcome back, or welcome if you're new. My name is Erin, and I am fascinated by all things cult, true crime, and unique spiritual practices, and today we literally get all three. So I'd like to say it's a jackpot, but that feels really insensitive to today's story. So without further ado, let's jump into this. Because the Fall River cult case isn't just a cautionary tale about the dangers of manipulation and blind obedience. It highlights the failures of a society that completely overlooked those who are most at risk. We're talking runaways, S-workers, and marginalized individuals. Nobody noticed what was going on to these poor people until it was too late. Today, we're going to start with the tragic events that unfolded on the night of October 13th, 1979. It was this night that the lifeless body of 17-year-old Dorene Levesque was discovered beneath the bleachers of Diamond Vocational High School. Her hands were bound with rope, her face bruised and swollen from blunt force trauma, and her body was riddled with stab wounds. Dorene's tragic fate began long before she became entangled with the Fall River cult. She was born in 1962 in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and she came from a working-class family who struggled to make ends meet. Like many young girls from unstable homes, Dorene faced difficulties early on. Her parents' relationship was fraught with tension, and when they eventually divorced, her home life only deteriorated further. The divorce created this unstable environment that left Dorene searching for guidance and stability in all the wrong places. By her early teens, she began skipping school and rebelling against authority. She was drawn to more older, reckless crowds, many of whom introduced her to a world of petty crime and substance use. Her rebellious nature led to clashes with her family, and, like I'm sure you guessed it, she eventually ran away from home, preferring the uncertainty of the streets to the dysfunction within her household. But life on the streets was unforgiving, especially for a teenage girl who had nowhere to turn. She drifted between shelters, cheap motels, and the homes of acquaintances. She couldn't even call them her friends. Eventually, she was pulled into the S-trade, a very dangerous and obviously predatory industry that preyed on vulnerable young runaways just like her. In Fall River, the red light district became both her home and her prison, where she learned to navigate the dangers of pimps, violent crimes, and law enforcement. But despite the dangers, she remained hopeful that she might eventually escape and build a better future for herself. It was within this bleak and unforgiving world that Dorene crossed paths with Robin Murphy, one of the key members of Carl Drew's cult. Robin was an established figure in Fall River's underworld. Seeing Dorene as an easy target, Robin pulled her into Drew's orbit with promises of protection and camaraderie. Dorene, who's desperate for stability, may have seen this cult as a chance to belong to something larger than herself. But what she didn't realize was that she had just sealed her fate. On the fateful night of October 13th, 1979, Dorene was lured to a secluded area beneath the bleachers of the high school. Whether she was taken there under the pretense of a meeting or by force still remains uncertain. But what is clear is that she never left alive. Her body was discovered later that night, with those hands bound with rope and her skull literally shattered by repeated blows. Her body had so many stab wounds, and the sheer brutality of this crime suggested not just a murder, but some kind of ritualistic killing that had been designed to send some kind of cryptic message. The discovery of her body was the first clue that something sinister was unfolding in Fall River. However, at the time, law enforcement had no idea that this was just the beginning of a series of ritualistic murders that would expose the darkest corners of the town's criminal underworld. Shortly after, in November 1979, another body surfaced. This time, it was 22-year-old Barbara Raposa. And like Dorene, Barbara had been involved in S work and had known the people operating in the Fall River's underworld. Her body was found in a remote area of Fall River, showing similar signs of extreme violence. She had been essayed, beaten, and stabbed. Investigators were now believing that they were dealing with a pattern. These were not just random killings, but something more methodical. Barbara had confided in a few close acquaintances that she was afraid for her life in the weeks leading up to her death. She mentioned that she knew too much about a certain group of people, but by the time law enforcement pieced this all together, it was just too late to protect her. And I hope you didn't think this rampage of ritualistic killings of women was about to end, because there was another one. Karen Marsden was one of the most tragic figures in the Fall River cult case, not just because of the horrifying way she died, but because of how desperately she tried to escape her fate. She was born in the mid-1950s, and she also had a really difficult upbringing that had been marked by poverty and instability. Like many of the other victims, she found herself drawn into the dangerous world of S work in Fall River's red light district. She was a mother to a young son whom she loved dearly, and despite her involvement on the streets, she hoped to one day find a way to get out and create a better life for her child. Karen became entangled with Carl Drew's cult through the underground S trade. Initially, she was drawn in through acquaintances who introduced her to Drew and his growing circle of followers. And at first, this cult might have seemed like protection. It seemed to be an informal group that provided security in a very violent world. But it soon became clear that this protection had come at a terrible price. Karen witnessed firsthand the brutal murder of Dorene Levesque, a moment that left her deeply shaken. She knew what Drew and his followers were capable of, and the fear of becoming the next victim absolutely consumed her. And unlike some of the others, Karen was not actually fully committed to Drew's teachings. She was really skeptical of his claims of having supernatural power, and as the cult's violence escalated, she started looking for a way out. Now, realizing the immense danger she was in, Karen made a crucial decision. She went to the police. She provided authorities with information about Dorene's murder and named Carl Drew as the ringleader and exposed the cult's violent and ritualistic practices. However, she was really scared and hesitant to share everything she knew. She feared that if the cult found out that she had spoken to the police, she would be killed. And her fears were justified. After cooperating with authorities, she attempted to distance herself from the cult. But Drew and his followers, they were watching her closely. They considered her a liability and began planning her execution as a warning to others who might think about leaving or talking to the police. And in February of 1980, Karen Marsden disappeared. The details of her murder are among the most gruesome of all of the Fall River cult killings. According to later testimonies, Karen was brought to a secluded wooded area where she was brutally beaten and tortured. Her fingernails were torn off, her hair was ripped from her scalp, and ultimately, she was beheaded. Her head was allegedly used in some kind of dark ritual, and this further reinforced the cult's twisted beliefs in satanic power and sacrifice. Her remains were later discovered in scattered pieces. Her skull was found separate from her body. The sheer brutality of her killing sent shockwaves through the community. It was not just a murder. It was a ritualistic display meant to instill fear in anyone who dared to defy Carl Drew. So, who was this cult leader and how did he come to be? Carl Drew was born in 1954 in New Hampshire, and he was the son of a deeply impoverished family. His early life was marked by instability, abuse, and exposure to extreme hardship. His father actually abandoned the whole family when Carl was very young and left his mother to raise multiple children on her own. So, she had little to no resources, especially for the time. It's the 1950s. Drew's childhood was one of extreme poverty, and he was forced to work from a very early age to help support his struggling family. And by the time he was a teenager, Drew had already become familiar with violence. He grew up in a chaotic environment where physical abuse was common, both at home and in the rough communities where he lived. And with no stable parental guidance, Drew quickly fell into a life of crime. He dropped out of school and began working on farms in rural areas of New England, where he gained this reputation for being very aggressive and having a very short temper. And as he moved into adulthood, Drew started to gravitate more towards organized crime, and he eventually found his way to Fall River, Massachusetts, where he became a pimp in the town's notorious red light district. Unlike some of the other criminals operating in the area, Drew ruled his S-workers with an iron fist. He was known for his cruelty, and he used extreme violence to maintain control over the women who worked for him. Beatings were common, and those who tried to leave his employment faced severe punishment. But Drew wanted more than just money. He craved power. He soon realized that fear was his greatest tool, and he began adopting elements of satanic worship to further cement his influence over his S-workers that he was in charge of, who would become his followers. So in the 1970s, the satanic panic was spreading through the media, and Drew took advantage of these growing fears and styled himself as this demonic figure with supernatural connections. He openly declared that he was the son of Satan, and that those who followed him would be rewarded with power and protection, while those who defied him would suffer unimaginable consequences. Through psychological manipulation and just raw brutality, Drew was able to amass a following of young, vulnerable individuals, mostly S-workers and addicts, who all believed that obeying him was their only chance at survival. He took advantage of vulnerable people who needed help, and his cult was born in the shadows of Fall River's criminal underworld. And once under his control, his followers became pawns in his deadly game. Now, while Carl Drew outwardly proclaimed himself to be the son of Satan, whether he truly believed in his own supernatural status remains a matter of debate. Many of his followers were convinced that he had dark powers, but some investigators and psychologists who later studied the case suggested that Drew's embrace of Satanism was more a tool of control than an actual genuine religious belief. I mean, he was a master manipulator who used fear and violence to exert dominance over his cult. He understood that presenting himself as this supernatural entity would give him absolutely unparalleled control over his followers, many of whom were already vulnerable and easily influenced. By claiming to have this direct connection to Satan, he ensured their absolute obedience. Because after all, defying him meant not just facing his wrath, but also eternal damnation. However, there are indications that Drew may have internalized aspects of his own mythology. Some reports suggest that during cult rituals, he would enter these trance-like states and he would speak in tongues and act as though he was possessed. Most likely these were calculated performances, but if they were moments of genuine belief, it all really remains uncertain. It's possible that Drew started as this con man exploiting satanic imagery to control his followers, but eventually became so consumed by this persona he had created that it was almost like he became the persona. He changed his identity. He started getting really paranoid, and he increased his reliance on these violent rituals and willingness to create extreme acts of brutality that suggest that over time that maybe he did come to believe in his own mythology, or at least he believed that the power he wielded over others made him more than just a man. But regardless of whatever his personal beliefs were, the terror he inflicted on his victims was very real. So whether he saw himself as the embodiment of Satan or simply used the title to control others, the end result was still the same: a reign of terror that left a trail of death and destruction in its wake. And it is just so incredibly heartbreaking. I've been attending some more spiritual events and practices. I'm thinking of starting like a new series on my channel that kind of like maybe like a vlog where I go and I do some kind of ritual. I've done 2 things recently that were very fascinating. And most recently, I was at this sound bath that was it was much different than any sound bath I've ever been to before. It wasn't just like beautiful singing bowls. There was just like a lot of stuff going on, and I'm happy to maybe like go live and share about the experience. And then the previous new moon, I went to this like witch ritual and like a lot of things were happening, and I just am like, I want to talk about this because I just find different spiritual practices really interesting. And something that I thought about when I was at the sound bath was, imagine you're in this community where everyone is group sharing because the leader asked people to do a group share, and immediately my red flags start waving in my head, and nobody really wanted to share. We were all pretty zenned out. But it really provided this new level of empathy for me. Like, what if you had been involved in this community where you just feel inherently connected because you're sharing all of these vulnerable things? Because when you're in a group setting and you start sharing things with this group, you just intrinsically, subconsciously feel more connected to them, especially if you're being vulnerable, and extra especially if you've never been able to be vulnerable. So it made me realize, like, man, the betrayal of your entire worldview that would happen if you were involved in a cult, and then later you find out that you were in a cult and all of it was fake and all of it was false. Your entire family, your entire world just blows up in your face. So in this particular cult, we have this insular group of people that are all dependent on the group because they don't have family, they don't have friends, they're all breaking the law. There's tons of collateral that the leader has against everybody. Most likely he controls their income. Most likely he controls who they see and how they work. And he's claiming to offer this level of protection, not just from police, not just from the men these women are working with, but also from Satan. I mean, it feels like in this group, these stakes are so high for the women that are involved. I mean, their protection depends on this. Whether they end up in jail or not depends on this cult leader and the cult. I mean, they start seeing him murder people. It must just have been so utterly terrifying for these women. It's utterly horrifying. It really is. If you take a second to just put yourself in their shoes, it would be mortifying. I feel like you would have to just do whatever this man told you to do, no matter if it was grotesque, gruesome, horrifying, or something you would never normally do, because you would be so scared. That's why they say fear and anger are the two emotions that someone is in that makes them the most vulnerable to be controlled. And to be honest, we are seeing that in America right now. We've been seeing it for the last decade or so, where like people are making decisions just out of fear, just out of this us versus them mentality. And then you make that decision and you realize, oh, well, this leader is not all that he said he was, all he's cracked up to be. And if you know, you know. But that's a rant for another day. Let's get back to the Satanic Panic, because we can't forget that the Satanic Panic was sweeping across America at this time. And so the Fall River cult wasn't just a product of mass hysteria. Drew's followers genuinely believed or feared his proclamations of satanic power. Drew claimed that Satan demanded blood, and through sacrifice, they would achieve protection and supernatural strength. So, what were these rituals exactly? They were grotesque, and they were deliberately designed to instill terror in the participants. Now, these ceremonies often took place in very remote wooded areas or abandoned buildings or other secluded parts of the town where their horrific acts would go unnoticed. The rituals were structured in a way that combined elements of traditional occult symbolism with Drew's personal sadistic, weird tendencies. New members of the cult were required to undergo an initiation process, which often involved animal sacrifice. Cats, goats, and small livestock were used in these ceremonies. Their blood drained onto pentagrams drawn in dirt or carved into wooden floors. Drew would force members to recite incantations that he claimed were in these ancient languages, though they were typically just meaningless strings of words that were meant to enhance his mystique and control over the group. Members were expected to participate in the killing of animals as a way to prove their devotion, and refusing to do so meant severe punishment, either in the form of beatings or even worse. And this practice desensitized members to violence, making the transition to human sacrifice a lot easier for Drew to enforce. This initiation process was designed to break new recruits, both physically and psychologically, ensuring complete obedience to Carl Drew. New members were often chosen from the vulnerable. They were runaways, S-workers, and simply those with nowhere else to turn. The rites all varied in severity, but all had one purpose: to instill fear and loyalty while severing any remaining ties the recruits had to the outside world. There were a few different stages of initiation. Number 1, we have isolation and psychological manipulation. Before the actual initiation, new recruits were isolated from their previous support systems. Drew and his enforcers would subject them to long hours of fear-based indoctrination, convincing them that their only safety lay within the cult. They were told that leaving would result in some kind of supernatural punishment or some other kind of brutal retaliation. Number 2, they were forced to participate in these rituals. They were required to witness and participate in increasingly violent rituals. They started with animal sacrifices, where they were forced to kill a cat or a goat or another small animal, and then that animal's blood would be smeared onto their bodies as a sign of their new allegiance to Satan. In some cases, initiates were forced to drink the blood of the sacrificed animal to reinforce their bond to the group through this act of ultimate submission. 3, there were also blood oaths. Each new recruit was expected to take a blood oath, where they would either cut themselves or be cut by a senior member of the cult. Their blood was then mixed with Carl Drew's blood, symbolizing a permanent bond. And this blood was sometimes smeared onto symbols drawn in dirt or carved into wooden planks, and this would signify the recruit's binding commitment to the cult and its leader. And number 4, there were also ritual beatings. To prove their devotion, initiates were often forced to endure beatings. sometimes administered by multiple cult members at once. These beatings were not just tests of loyalty. They were meant to break the initiate's will and instill an intense fear of defying the cult. Some recruits were even forced to inflict violence on others, either beating a fellow initiate or harming someone outside the group to prove that they were willing to follow orders without question. And of course, we have sexual exploitation. Many female recruits were subjected to SA as a part of their initiation. Drew used this as another tool of control, reinforcing his dominance and their subjugation. Women who resisted were severely punished, often through physical violence or even being threatened with death. And, of course, we have what they called the final test. And this was the participation in a human sacrifice. The most devout recruits were sometimes required to take part in a human sacrifice. This often meant helping to lure, restrain, or even kill a victim as a demonstration of their complete allegiance to Carl Drew. Those who hesitated were subjected to further abuse or, in some cases, marked for death themselves as potential informants. Through all of these initiation rites, Carl Drew transformed his followers into loyal enforcers, willing to carry out these unspeakable acts in his name. The brutal indoctrination process ensured that once someone was in the cult, leaving was nearly impossible without risking their whole life. So, how was this cult taken down? The investigation into the Fall River cult began in earnest after the gruesome murder of Karen Marsden in 1980. However, law enforcement had already been aware of disturbing activity in the city's red light district following the discovery of Dorene Levesque's mutilated body in October of 1979. The cops had a hunch that because of how brutal her death was, that there was something really sinister going on within their town, but at the time they had very little to go on. But the real breakthrough came when Karen Marsden, who was terrified for her life, actually approached the police and confessed what she knew about the cult. She provided law enforcement with these chilling details about Carl Drew, the cult, its rituals, and the violent control he exerted over his followers. She confirmed what investigators suspected. Dorene Levesque's murder had been a ritualistic sacrifice, carried out as an offering to Satan. Marsden's testimony was invaluable, but it also marked her for death. Drew and his followers, particularly Robin Murphy, his prime recruit, viewed Marsden as a threat who needed to be eliminated. So shortly after cooperating with the police, Marsden suddenly disappeared. And within weeks, her remains were found scattered in a remote area. And since her murder was far more gruesome than the others, it was clearly intended to send a message to anyone who considered betraying the cult. So obviously this murder added a ton of urgency to the case. So investigators intensified their efforts to take down Drew's cult. Robin Murphy, obviously that key member of the group, was arrested in connection with the crimes. And under pressure from law enforcement, she made a shocking decision. She actually turned on Carl Drew. She provided a detailed confession that implicated Drew as the mastermind behind the murders. She described the cult blood rituals, the brutal treatment of women, and how Drew used fear and violence to keep his followers in line. So as investigators gathered more evidence, they built this really compelling case against Drew, Murphy, and others involved in the cult's activities. In 1981, Carl Drew stood trial for the murder of Karen Marsden. The prosecution presented a horrifying picture of his cult, arguing that he had orchestrated a reign of terror based on satanic rituals and violent control. The most compelling testimony came from Robin Murphy, who detailed the night of Marsden's murder, explaining how Drew had personally beaten, tortured, and ultimately decapitated her. The prosecution's case was strengthened by forensic evidence that tied the crime scene to the cult, as well as the brutal manner in which the victims were killed. While Drew continued to proclaim his innocence and claimed that he was being framed, The jury found the evidence overwhelmingly convincing. Carl Drew was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His conviction marked the official end of the Fall River cult. But questions lingered about whether all of those involved had been brought to justice. Robin Murphy, despite her cooperation, was not immune to punishment. Given her deep involvement in the cult's activities and her participation in the murders, she was also sentenced to life in prison. However, her willingness to testify against Drew played a role in later developments in her case. Murphy later sought to overturn her conviction, claiming that her confession had been coerced by police and that she had been manipulated into making statements against Drew. Over the years, she filed multiple appeals, and in 2004, she was briefly released on parole. However, she was later reincarcerated for parole violations, and legal debates over her culpability and the validity of her testimony continue to this day. The Fall River cult murders left an indelible mark on the community. The case became one of the most infamous examples of satanic ritual crime in the United States, fueling fears about cult activity during the height of the Satanic Panic. However, some legal experts and journalists have questioned whether the satanic elements of the case were exaggerated or even misinterpreted, pointing out that Drew's primary motivations may have been rooted in power and control rather than any real legitimate religious belief. Despite the convictions, some believe that others involved in the cult's activities did in fact escape justice. Testimonies suggested that there were more individuals present during the killings, but not all of them were identified or prosecuted. Additionally, questions remain about whether Robin Murphy's shifting statements over the years indicate deeper complexities to the case that may have never been fully explored. But today, Carl Drew remains behind bars and he still proclaims his innocence. He has filed numerous appeals, all of which have been denied. So whether or not he was truly the son of Satan as he claimed, or merely a brutal criminal who used fear to control others, his legacy is still one of violence and manipulation that will forever haunt Fall River. This remains to be one of the most disturbing cases of ritualistic violence and cult activity in American history. The Satanic Panic of the 1980s led to so many false allegations and hysteria, but the events in Fall River were all real. Vulnerable young women were exploited, manipulated, and ultimately sacrificed in the name of someone wanting power and control, in the name of some weird, twisted ideology. For the families of the victims, justice was served, but closure remains elusive. The town of Fall River, once known for its industrial legacy, will forever carry the dark stain of these crimes. And it's something that we just can't forget. We cannot forget the sheer bravery that Karen Marsden shared in coming forward to the police. She lost her life because she was brave enough to speak out against the cult. And if this story of this cult doesn't provide enough tangible, ample proof that indoctrination is real and prove that the mind is easily malleable, especially if fear is invoked, if there's so much fear that you will be killed, that's why people can't leave cults like this. And so when we talk about these things and the more we learn about these things, we really have to remember to be sympathetic and empathetic to this experience, because on the outside, it is easy to judge and say, oh, you shouldn't have gotten involved. You made your choice. You were an adult, blah, blah, blah. But it's not always black and white. It's nuanced and it's not simple. Indoctrination is a complicated process. And what's even more complicated is deconstructing the beliefs you learned. And what's scary about how many cults that are still active in the United States is that they could lead to death and destruction, just like this one. So please, everybody, let me know what you thought about this story, this case. It's gut-wrenching, it's horrifying, it's scary, it's terrifying. I mean, man, so many cults were just like thriving between the 60s through 90s that like it's hard to wrap your head around all of them. And the fact that there is a giant cult that's now taking over this country. So I'm trying to not fall into just total and complete utter despair. The disassociation is real. All right. Anyways, guys, let me know what you think. If you watched to the end of the video, leave a black heart down in the comments below. Let me know what you think. And let me know if you want me to go live. Maybe I can go live this upcoming weekend. It would be the weekend of February 22nd, I think. Let me know. Thank y'all so much. I really appreciate your support. And I hope you have a wonderful week, y'all. Thank you so much. And I will see you soon. Bye.